When the leader of France tells the President of the United States publicly on foreign soil to be serious, you know the cracks in the Western alliance have gone far deeper than anyone in Washington is willing to admit. And when that same confrontation unfolds against the backdrop of a war that has been raging for over a month, with one of the world's most critical oil arteries still shut down, the stakes of this diplomatic rupture are not abstract. They are measured in oil prices, in global trade routes, and in the future architecture of Western power. Welcome to Tomorrow Updates. I'm Julian Thorne, and tonight we examine two realities that the world's media is covering separately, but that are, in truth, inseparable. The first is the deepening divide between Washington and its European allies over how to end the Iran war, and specifically the fierce debate over the Strait of Hormuz. The second is a story unfolding in near total silence, inside the prisons of Iran, where a regime fighting for its survival is executing its own people at a pace that has not been seen in decades. These are not two different stories. They are two faces of the same crisis. Let us begin with the public confrontation that no one in diplomatic circles expected to reach this level of candor. French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking during a state visit to South Korea on Thursday, said it would be unrealistic to launch a military operation to force open the Strait of Hormuz after President Donald Trump challenged allies to work toward reopening it. Those words, unrealistic, are careful, precise, and deliberate. This is not a president speaking off the cuff. This is one of the most experienced diplomatic operators in the Western world, choosing his language with full awareness of the consequences. Macron told reporters that forcing the strait open by military means would take forever and would expose all those who go through it to threats from the IRGC's coastal forces, who possess significant military resources, as well as from ballistic missiles. That is not a political opinion. That is a military assessment. And it is one that a significant number of Western defense analysts privately share, even if they would not say so with Macron's directness. But Macron did not stop at strategic analysis. He went further, and in doing so, he crossed into territory that is almost unprecedented for a head of state speaking publicly about an American president. Macron accused Trump of constantly contradicting himself on the Iran war. He said, "You have to be serious. When you want to be serious, you don't say the opposite every day of what you said the day before, and perhaps you shouldn't talk every day." Pause on that for a moment. The President of France, America's oldest ally, is telling the President of the United States, in front of the international press, that his daily pronouncements on a war he started are undermining the credibility of the entire Western response. Macron also accused Trump of undermining NATO by creating daily doubt about American commitment to the alliance. He said, "If you create daily doubt about your commitment, you hollow it out." These are not the words of a diplomatic disagreement. This is a formal indictment of American strategic leadership, delivered in measured, professional language, which makes it far more damaging than any emotional outburst. Now let us understand the deeper context here. Macron said France has been working with European and other partners to build a coalition to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, but only once hostilities have ended. He said the strait can only be reopened in consultation with Iran, and that the precondition for any solution must be a ceasefire and a resumption of negotiation. This is the European position, and it is coherent. It is not pacifism, and it is not indifference. France has a carrier battle group deployed in the region. European navies are monitoring the situation. What Europe is refusing to do is join a military operation to force open a 21-mile waterway that is defended by one of the most densely armed coastlines in the Middle East. Under active war conditions, without a ceasefire in place, the military logic is sound. Any ship attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz under current conditions would face not only IRGC speedboats and coastal missile batteries, but also Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, a threat that even the United States Navy currently considers too dangerous to challenge head-on. But Trump's frustration with allies is not purely military. It is political and it is personal. He has framed the European refusal as a betrayal, a failure of solidarity after years of American commitment to European security, including in Ukraine. His argument is simple, emotionally resonant, and politically powerful within his own base. "We were there for you. You were not there for us." The problem is that the European counterargument is equally coherent. This is not a war we were consulted on, not a conflict that falls under NATO's defensive mandate, and not one where joining the military campaign would be politically survivable for any European government. When asked directly about Trump's threats to pull the United States from NATO, Macron declined to comment in detail. He said, I don't want to provide a running commentary on an operation the Americans have decided on their own with Israel. They can deplore the fact they're not being helped, but that's not our operation. We want peace as soon as possible. That sentence, "we want peace as soon as possible," sounds like a platitude. But read it carefully. It is a quiet, devastating critique. It implies that the party conducting the war may not, in fact, be prioritizing peace as quickly as it claims. Now, what does this diplomatic confrontation mean for the future? In the short term, the primary consequence is a further erosion of trust between Washington and its European partners. The transatlantic alliance, which has survived Cold War tensions, Iraq and Afghanistan, is now navigating something qualitatively different, a situation where the United States unilaterally launched a major military operation, demanded alliance participation after the fact, and is now threatening consequences for those who declined. Macron warned specifically that Trump's daily contradictions on the Iran conflict and NATO are creating operational confusion for allies trying to formulate coherent responses, and that the accumulation of conflicting signals makes coordinated Western diplomacy nearly impossible. In the medium term, Europe is accelerating what was already an inevitable process: strategic autonomy. The war in Iran has demonstrated, more clearly than any political speech ever could, that European security interests and American strategic choices can diverge significantly. The lesson being drawn in Paris, Berlin, and London is not that America is an enemy. It is that America, under certain administrations, is an unpredictable partner, and unpredictable partners require contingency planning. In the long term, the question that Macron's statement forces into the open is one that the post-World War II international order has never had to directly confront. What happens to the Western alliance if the anchor of that alliance, the United States, begins to behave like a revisionist power? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that European foreign ministries are quietly working on right now. And here is the expert perspective that serious viewers need to hold on to. Macron's intervention is not just about the Strait of Hormuz, it is about credibility, both America's and Europe's. Washington's credibility is at stake because, as Macron pointed out, the United States has sent contradictory signals on virtually every aspect of this conflict. Whether the war will end in days or weeks, whether a ceasefire has been requested or denied, whether NATO is a paper tiger or an indispensable alliance, whether the Strait of Hormuz matters or doesn't, Europe's credibility is at stake because it has drawn a line: this is not our war, and it must now demonstrate that its alternative vision of conflict resolution, based on negotiation and diplomacy, is not simply a cover for weakness, but a viable path to a stable outcome. The next 2 to 3 weeks will determine which vision prevails. If Trump secures a ceasefire on his terms, the American approach will be vindicated, at least politically. If the war drags on and the strait remains closed, the economic pressure on all parties, including the United States itself, will become impossible to sustain. There are no easy options in the Strait of Hormuz. The easiest exit, as Macron understands, runs not through a naval battle, but through a negotiating table. There is a second crisis unfolding right now, one that receives far less attention than the war in the air, but may ultimately prove more consequential for the future of Iran and the region. Inside the prisons of the Islamic Republic, a machinery of repression is running at a speed that human rights organizations are describing in terms that should stop every serious viewer in their tracks. To understand the full picture, we need to go back to December 28, 2025. The 2025 to 2026 Iranian protests began on that date amid a deepening economic crisis, following a sharp depreciation of the Iranian rial, rising inflation, and widespread shortages linked to international sanctions and years of government mismanagement. The unrest became the largest uprising in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, spreading to more than 200 cities across the country. The regime's response was swift and brutal. Iranian authorities carried out massacres of protesters, primarily on January 8th and 9th, when the death toll rose into the thousands. Amnesty International described January 2026 as the deadliest period of repression by the Iranian authorities in decades of its research. The human rights activists' news agency documented at least 7,007 confirmed deaths, including 6,488 adult protesters and 236 minors. More than 11,744 additional cases remained under review at the time of their February report. Those numbers are staggering. But what is happening now? In March and April of 2026, with a war raging overhead and the world's attention focused on missiles and oil prices, may represent the second, quieter chapter of a catastrophe. On March 19th, 3 young men, Saleh Mohammadi, age 19, Saeed Dawoodi, age 21, and Mehdi Ghassemi, who were all arrested during the January protests in Iran, were publicly hanged in Qom after being convicted of what the regime calls waging war against God. The executions followed grossly unfair trials with no semblance of due process and confessions obtained under torture. Rights groups and United Nations experts have warned of a new wave of mass executions, while also voicing concern over the safety of political prisoners during wartime. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners across Iran, including tens of thousands of protesters detained during the recent nationwide protests, are not only exposed to the risk of bombardment, but also face the danger of expedited executions carried out under the shadow of war. The phrase "under the shadow of war" is critical here. It is not incidental language. It describes a deliberate strategy. On March 23, the first deputy chief of the Iranian judiciary announced what he described as the operational phase of executing protesters' sentences. He stated explicitly, "The cases of the January rioters have been processed. Some cases have led to final verdicts and are being carried out, and several have been executed over the past few days. No leniency will be granted." This is a senior judicial official of the Islamic Republic, speaking on record, announcing that executions are being carried out as a matter of deliberate state policy, not as isolated judicial outcomes but as a coordinated program. Since the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising, Iranian authorities have embarked on an execution spree that has put to death thousands following grossly unfair trials, with the pace accelerating following the 12-day war in 2025 and now reaching a scale not seen in over 4 decades. 4 decades. That places us in the vicinity of the 1988 mass executions in Iran, a period in which thousands of political prisoners were killed inside prisons in a matter of weeks. Historians consider it one of the darkest episodes in the modern history of the Islamic Republic. Human rights organizations are now using that event as the historical benchmark against which current developments are being measured. Let us examine the mechanics of what is happening, because the process itself is as significant as the outcome. The commander-in-chief of Iran's law enforcement forces stated on live state television on March 10th, "If someone takes to the streets at the behest of the enemy, we do not consider them a protester or anything of that sort. We consider them an enemy, and we deal with them as we deal with an enemy." That statement tells us everything about the regime's logic. By framing protesters as agents of foreign enemies, particularly in the context of a war, the Iranian judiciary is able to collapse the legal distinction between civilian political dissent and armed opposition. Once that distinction collapses, the use of the death penalty becomes procedurally simple and publicly justifiable within the regime's own framework. The independent international fact-finding mission on Iran warned in March 2026 that the country's deepening human rights crisis, characterized by institutionalized repression on an unprecedented scale, includes violations that may amount to crimes against humanity and is likely to worsen. The UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran emphasized in a March 16th statement that the reported violations reflect systemic patterns rather than isolated incidents. The word systemic carries legal weight. It is not the language of concern. It is the language of accountability, the preliminary vocabulary of potential prosecution. Now, what is the strategic logic behind this acceleration? The regime's reasoning, while morally reprehensible, is strategically coherent from its own survival perspective. An estimated 50,000 people were arrested during the January protests. The Iranian government knows from history that detained activists who survive their imprisonment often become the core of the next wave of resistance. The executions are therefore not primarily about punishment. They are about elimination. They are about removing permanently the people most likely to lead a future uprising. Iran Human Rights Monitor warned that with an estimated 50,000 individuals arrested during the January uprising, the current approach is a dire warning of an impending human catastrophe and another political massacre by the Islamic Republic. The war provides cover for this process in a second, more cynical way. With international attention consumed by oil prices, missile strikes, diplomatic standoffs between Trump and Macron, and daily ceasefire negotiations, the humanitarian crisis inside Iranian prisons is receiving a fraction of the scrutiny it would receive in peacetime. Security forces in Iran have arrested more than 1,500 additional people since the beginning of the war, carrying out often violent raids against ordinary citizens, activists, students, religious minorities, and the families of protesters and activists living abroad. Amnesty International reported that 7 men face imminent execution after 4 were secretly executed in late March following grossly unfair revolutionary court proceedings. Now, what are the future implications of what is happening inside Iran's prisons? In the immediate term, the next weeks, the executions will continue unless the international community applies focused, coordinated pressure. That pressure is currently complicated by the war, by the breakdown in Western alliance cohesion we discussed in Part 1, and by the regime's deliberate internet restrictions that limit the flow of verified information. In the medium term, the scale of the crackdown will shape the character of whatever government emerges in Iran after this war ends. If the current regime survives in a weakened form, it will be a regime that has executed thousands of its own people and arrested tens of thousands more. The social contract between that government and its population will be one of terror, not legitimacy. If the regime collapses, which remains a possibility, though not a certainty, the transition will be complicated by the fact that the generation of activists most capable of leading it has been partially decimated by the execution campaign now underway. In the long term, the record of these events will form the basis of international legal proceedings, potentially including prosecution before the International Criminal Court. The UN fact-finding mission on Iran, the documentation by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Iran Human Rights Organization, all of this is building an evidentiary record that is designed to survive the current moment and reach forward into accountability. Here is the perspective that viewers need to carry with them. There is a tendency, in covering conflicts of this scale, to reduce everything to geopolitics, to speak in the language of deterrence, oil choke points, alliance structures, and presidential speeches. That language is important. We use it in this program because it is necessary to understand what is driving these events. But behind every policy decision, behind every closed strait and every diplomatic confrontation, there are individual human beings. A 19-year-old wrestler named Saleh Mohammadi was arrested on January 15th. He was sentenced to death on February 4th, 20 days later. He was executed on March 19th. He was not a soldier. He was not a spy. He was a young man who took to the streets in his city during a national uprising. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen. The Trump-Macron disagreement will eventually be resolved or papered over. The war will end. But the Saleh Mohammadis of Iran, the teenagers, the students, the protesters arrested in 50,000 homes across 200 cities, their fate is being decided right now, in the silence between missile strikes, in courtrooms that hold hearings lasting a few hours, and issue death sentences that are carried out in days. That silence is the story that the world must not allow to be drowned out by the noise of war. I'm Julian Thorne. This is Tomorrow Updates.